Buddy. Today, I've got a really interesting deck for you. This one is a Threbin resource destruction deck. Now, I've done a video on a similar deck in the past, but this deck actually got a little bit of support in the form of Divine Justice, and so that's why I am covering it again. The main idea of this deck is that you ramp your engine up. And let me pause for a second because I do want to talk about the sacrifice. I run Forgiveness, and so I'm sacrificing cards that will be useful in the late game right now because I can pick them back up with my Forgiveness card. So that's why I sacrifice Divine Justice there, even though it's the key card of the deck. Anyway, the whole idea of this deck is to ramp up until you get a ton of resources, and then use Resource Destruction to basically have way more resources than the opponent, and win that way through a combination of just allies and weapons that your opponent can't really deal with because they have literally no resources. So that's the idea of this deck. And so here we're just going to Loom of Fate here. We were playing Ruby Embellished Dagger here just to get more resources and sacrificing every turn, even though it sometimes does get a little tricky. So we attack with the Ruby Embellished Dagger because we really just want to get cards into the resource pile. And so we're actually just going to play Wizent Staff here. And another part of this deck that you really need a lot of is draw. So we're also trying to draw a lot of cards with cards like Wizent Staff and Loom of Fate. The reason we don't mind as much when our opponent draws is because they're not going to have that many resources soon. So we're going to basically use that to our advantage. Now, the reason here that I go ahead and I have a very interesting choice here. I can either Tidal Wave, which is what I end up just deciding to do, or I can Divine Justice. Normally when I get to 7 resources, I like to Divine Justice right away, but in this situation with my opponent having an 8 attack ally, I just thought it was way safer to play the Tidal Wave in that position. Now that our opponent has only a 6 attack ally, which is still a lot to be fair, I think it's a lot safer to play Divine Justice. So let's talk about Divine Justice for a second. This is a 7 cost ability, so it's very expensive and very hard to get to the point where you can comfortably play it. It gives you 3 health, so it doesn't heal. That's important because you can go over your max health this way. It deals 3 damage to the opposing hero, it blows up one of their resources, and it becomes a resource for you. So if you think about it, it is 7 cost, but because it's giving you a resource, it really gives you back a resource, so it's kind of like 6 resources. It's blowing up your opponent's resource, which is really, really good, and healing and dealing damage, so it's got a lot on it going for it for just 1 card. So it's very, very strong, and the only downside, really, is the fact that you have to be on 7 resources or higher to play it. But we are on 7 resources, so that is what's going to allow us to basically use that to our advantage there. So now the other big part of this deck is going to be the Tidal Wave. The Tidal Wave is basically going to be how we're going to clear away our opponent's threats before we start doing the resource destruction. And now we can play cards that I used in my previous resource destruction Threbin decks, like Plague. This is going to remove 2 of my opponent's resources and basically remove one of my own, but because I've got so many more resources than my opponent, that doesn't really factor in as much. And so now we're at the stage in the game where we're just going to be plaguing and Divine Justicing and doing whatever we can to blow up our opponent's resources. So that takes them basically out of the game. And as you can see, we've taken our opponent so far down from 6 resources where they were originally at to now 2 resources. That's going to make it much harder for them to play their fatties. Now, because it is a Bloodfang deck, Bloodfang actually has an ability that somewhat counters our strategy in that it can summon cards from the hand using its hero power, regardless of the amount of resources they have, but we're keeping them on 1 resource here, so that's going to be really dangerous and hard for them to really do anything about. I just go ahead and I use the hero power on Threbin to take out the Woven Bellower. I just want to save some health here. That's the main reason I did that. I'm fully expecting to Tidal Wave soon, but the problem is that I can't lose too much health because the only healing we have really is the Divine Justice. and that can get dangerous really quickly. So that's why I chose to do that there. I also didn't sacrifice this turn, and so later in the game, you don't always have to be sacrificing every turn, especially now that my opponent is on 3 resources. That is really, really low. So yeah, and then we're just going to Divine Justice again. So as you can see, this is a very rude deck that is all about basically, making the opponent have a miserable time and having basically no resources. And yeah, when you're on 3 resources as a Bloodfang deck that mostly basically uses fatties, it can be a little rough there. So anyway, this deck, it's great, but then one question is, well, how do you win? Well, the answer is basically once you've gotten to this point in the game, I didn't have to do this, but because it was too good of an opportunity to pass up, I used Cobraskin Wraps twice. That's going to actually make our opponent have 0 resources. So it's like the opponent just started the game here. And so 0 to 13 resources, that is pretty insane there. But yeah, the answer to that is basically we're using this card called Ruby Embellished Dagger. Now, when you have more than 8 resources or 8 resources or more, it actually becomes a 2/4 weapon, and that's really, really good, actually. That's like 8 damage over time. And with Threbin's ability, you can basically use 3 Shadow Energy to deal an additional 2 arcane damage. So you can often close out the game with just your weapons, the Ruby Embellished Dagger, and Threbin's ability. So because this is more of a slower control deck, you can kind of chip away at your opponent every turn while keeping them on like 2 resources, and that's kind of how you win the game there. Now, I do want to show you one of the deck's bad matchups. This is a game I actually lost against Serena. I think this is a winnable matchup, but it's an uphill battle for sure. It's very difficult, especially once Serena drops the Dagger and Gimbal. If you can't keep Serena down to 2 resources, then they can start discarding cards from your hand. And because we're such a resource-heavy deck, we really need all of the cards in our hand as possible. We need to have strong card draw and things like that. That's what makes Serena such a bad matchup for us, where they can discard cards from our hand and basically make it much harder to execute our strategy. On top of that, Serena has Stop Thief. Stop Thief gives them a resource. That makes it just so much harder for us to basically keep them below the 2 resources that we need to in order to kind of counter them there. So those are the main reasons why it's a little tricky for us. But yeah, anyway, here we're just going to go for a draw, and then just the same kind of normal play patterns. We're trying to gain resources, so I play the Ruby Embellished Dagger here. When that gets destroyed, we'll get another resource, which will be really nice. Now, this is a card that basically is a must-kill for us. Delaval basically says you can gain a resource for 1 Shadow Energy. I just wanted to get rid of that because I felt like if my opponent gets that off, it's just going to be too good for them. So that's why I did that there. Helm of Samed is really annoying here to bring back the Dagger and Gimbal. So yeah, that can be annoying, but here... okay, I actually hold off on the Divine Justices because I just want to go ahead and hit the face. I may have considered not playing Plague there, but I just wanted to basically keep my opponent down low on resources. Now, this just puts him in perfect position for a Stop Thief, which is really unfortunate, but yeah, so that's that. I go ahead and Divine Justice there, get another resource going. But now you can kind of see what the issue is. Serena can discard cards from her hand, and we don't have enough card draw because our Wizent staff got destroyed by the Stop Thief. And so because of that, we can kind of peter out against Serena a little bit when the opponent plays something like Stop Thief. So yeah, that's basically what happens here. Now, we're not totally out of the game yet. But I want to make sure that I can maximize the value of all my cards. So here I actually chose not to Tidal Wave, despite the fact that I could have killed the monk that way. I'm hoping my opponent plays an ally and I can use the Tidal to kill 2 of the allies. I'm aware that my opponent can discard one, so that's why I kept both Devoted Knights in my hand, just hoping that one of the Devoted Knights will be discarded instead of the Tidal Wave. And it really does pay off here. I'm able to Tidal Wave, get rid of 2 allies at once, and maybe hopefully make a comeback. So here I think yeah, we're not in the best spot, but definitely a good play there. Here's where I probably make my biggest mistake, and the one that costs me the game. I should have definitely Tidal Waved here, because this card can grow really fast. And I guess I wasn't really thinking about that. I decided not to Tidal Wave. I decided to go for more of a just put them on low resources thing and deal with this later, maybe with a weapon or something. And that really costs me the game there when Gyre and Gimbal comes out, and he's able to basically use the hit list to buff it up to 5 attack. And now that I'm on 2 health, that's basically game there. So even if I Tidal Wave here, Gyre and Gimbal can still take me out. So that's definitely something I misplayed there a little bit. But yeah, I think that just goes to show one of the tougher matchups of this deck, and how this deck has weaknesses, and how, especially with Serena being so popular, it's, it can be tough. But that said, you do have, some good, yeah, I lost to 2 other Serenas here. I did beat 1 Serena, but yeah, Serena can be rough. Other than that, though, I think you've got good matchups against some more slower decks, and just even like Dragons actually is a good matchup, because here's the thing about Dragons. For Dragons to work well, you have to skip your sack. And if you skip your sack against this deck, you're never going to have any resources. So, yeah, I think this has a great matchup against Dragons. And so, yeah, if you're seeing a lot of Dragons and not a lot of Serena, then I think this is a good deck. You can also consider cards like Shold, I think, is a really good counter to Serena. Now, that is going to interfere a little bit with the Ruby Embellished Dagger, potentially. If it is not your turn, I believe, I will have to confirm it, that this will exile your Ruby Embellished Dagger, but I'm not totally sure about that. That's just based on standard resolution order. I won't really get into that there. Okay, anyway, I'll just go over the deck list, though, before I get too deep into that, and what you could tech to kind of counter Serena. First off is 4 Devoted Knight. This is an excellent card, amazing early game, probably our best ramp card in the deck, because our opponent has to deal with it, or like it gives us a resource even if they do deal with it. But if they don't deal with it, it's a 3 attack ally, which is formidable in its own right. I'm actually really liking Delaval. I think this card is great against anything like Zaladar, Banebow. It's a very underrated card. Having Shroud, but also the ramp effect, makes it perfect in this deck. 3 Bad Santa is basically the idea behind Bad Santa in this deck, and this is actually something I probably should run on 4 even, is that your opponent, having them draw cards is not as bad in this deck, because of the fact that they're ideally going to be on low resources. So yeah, they get to draw a ton of cards because you're playing cards like Bad Santa and giving them cards, but as long as they're not like a low curve deck, they basically can't play any of them when they're on, like, say, 2 resources. So that's why I really like Bad Santa. The one downside is, again, if they are running a low to the ground deck with a bunch of 1 cost and 2 cost allies, it's still pretty good for them to draw 3 cards. So you don't always want to be playing this card. It's kind of like, it depends on the matchup, but in the right matchups, this is amazing, and it's just basically draw 3 because you don't care what the opponent draws. 2 Meltdown is nice. We run a lot of items that basically the reason we run them is for their effects, and not like because we want to keep them on the board. Sometimes actually destroying our own items is a benefit. For example, destroying Thoughtful Investment lets you play another one, or Ruby Embellished Dagger, when it's destroyed, becomes a resource. So I actually really do like Meltdown here. The reason I don't play more is, I guess, like, you have to have the item out, so it's like a 2-card combo. and it can be a little bricky sometimes. Like if you draw all your meltdowns and no items, then you're kind of stuck, and you don't always want to destroy items. So that's why I only run it on 2. This is definitely something you can experiment with on 3 or higher. I guess I just wanted to keep the deck a little low just for consistency, but you could definitely bump this up. Forgiveness is another great card because we run a lot of high cost or resource destruction cards that we just want to see later in the game, and also its other effect of giving us 1 shadow energy, that is actually kind of damage output in this deck, so that's why it's very valuable. Plague, another classic card for the resource destruction strategy, destroys 2 of our opponent's resources and 1 of our resources. It's a good card because of the fact that we will be in a position late game to have way more resources than the opponent. But I will say that this card is kind of really tough to use, and I often find myself sacrificing it just because of the fact that, I guess it's not as versatile as something like Divine Justice. Divine Justice is just always good if you can play it, but Plague can actually hurt you a little bit. Like sometimes if you're on 6 resources, you really don't want to be playing this card because you're going to get further from getting to your 7 cost 7 resource place that you want to be. So it's definitely tricky to use because you're also blowing up your own resources. For Tidal Wave, that's pretty self-explanatory. Divine Justice, just an amazing card. I think was heavily underrated by a lot of people. This is an excellent card. I think it's just a little bit toxic. You're definitely gonna make your opponent wanna cry a little bit when you put them on say 2 resources or sometimes 0 resources even. So and then just slowly chipping away at them while gaining health is just a really annoying card. So I think it's a great card in this style of deck, just keeping them on low resources. I would say even in like a standard deck it might be okay, like a control style deck, but definitely the main challenge here is getting to 7 resources. 2 Loom of Fate. I like this card because you can play it going second even. It's a 2-cost card, and we don't run any other like 2-cost cards in this deck, so it's good for something we can play on turn 2. Thoughtful Investment. This is another ramp card, so we're just maxing out on ramp, and same with Ruby Embellished Dagger. This is actually the reason we're running Threbin, just having that weapon there that we can cash in our hero power basically to deal in that extra damage. This is how we're closing out most games. For Cobraskin Wraps, this is another resource destruction card. I like this one a lot because it also draws you a card, and it also kind of helps you stay alive a little bit because of its defense. Finally, Wizent Staff. I really like this card. I might bump it up to 3, just because drawing cards is so important. Once you have this card out, you can kind of solve your draw issues pretty easily. Now, you are giving up damage output, but that's okay because with the cards you draw, you can basically resource destruct them a little bit faster. Anyway, that's the deck profile. Definitely a rude deck, so but kind of fun to play, I would say, at least. It's very different. It relies on a totally different strategy from, I would say, a lot of other decks. So if you're kind of curious about it, I would say give it a try. It's an interesting deck for sure, and you'll probably make your opponents hate you a little bit. But yeah, that's how it goes sometimes when you're playing these kind of alternate strategy decks. Anyway, that's all for the video. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and thanks for watching.